if we look at the volumes of these incidents and the impacts that they have on the victims, is perhaps two characteristics. It's a continuous imposition of cost on the victim, and that is asymmetrical. In August 25, there was the Jaguar Land Rover incident. It cost the UK economy £2 billion. That's highly asymmetric, right? Yeah. The numbers between the 26 report and the 25 report of cyber extortion, they increased by 45%.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. I'm Ajay Bhardwaj, Managing Director of Orange Cyberdefense UK. And today I'm joined by our Head of Security Research, Charl van der Walt. Thank you, Charl, for joining us. Today we're here to unpack the Security Navigator 2026. And Charl's going to help us do that unpacking. Charl, can you just give us a sense of what you've learned through 2025 and into 2026 that you feel is different or changing?
I think what stands out for me is a sense that we are experiencing cybercrime and cyber attacks from the place of a kind of a collective group of victims that are dealing with a sort of collective or cohesive set of adversaries. You know, what we've done since the dawn of security research is to categorize actors. Okay. And put them into boxes or silos, right? Where we say, okay, well, this guy's state-sponsored and this guy's criminally motivated. And I'm not sure when we actually look at what's happening in the landscape that those silos hold. But what we're seeing more and more is a merging of those behaviors.
Right.
So we see state actors engaging in cybercrime. We see what we call hacktivist actors being ideologically motivated and aligned with the political goals of a state, so acting independently, but really progressing the political goals of a nation that they stand for, stand behind. And then we see criminal actors, maybe not intentionally, but coincidentally, also reflecting the political goals of the state.
Is that a change, or do you think it's always been there?
It's not a change this year from last, but I think it's becoming more apparent. Right. This year, for the first time, we reveal data that we've collected over about a 3-year period about efforts by global law enforcement to disrupt or deter cybercrime. And so over the last few years, law enforcement agencies across the world have really kind of stepped up their game in terms of trying to counter these threat actors, take them out. And we've been studying those operations to understand who's doing the countering, how do they work together, what kinds of actors do they counter, how do they counter them? Because you can indict and arrest someone, or you can sanction them, or you can dox them, or you can try and disrupt their operations, right? Take down their servers, things like that. What you see is that like 54% maybe, of all of these actors are concentrated in very clear clusters around the former Soviet republics and around North Korea and around China. And it also happens that those are the clusters where most of the state-backed activity originates, at least that targets the West. Yeah. And it's also the clusters where most of this kind of politically motivated hacktivism originates. So you can't kind of help noticing that there's a concentration, right? And that it's politically framed. And then actually all of these actors are tolerated in those geographies, right? They're operating without any fear of repercussions.
So tolerated, not supported.
Hard to know. Okay. You know, we can't always look behind the curtain, but certainly tolerated. And one gets a sense, if you look at how closely aligned they are, and if sort of how cohesive the pressure system is that they create, then you can't help thinking that, you know, there's a sort of a political serendipity that emerges there that I think maybe just struck us this year more than most. And of course, it's biased because we are in the West. We see things from that perspective, and because these law enforcement agencies are mostly in the West. And I think the effect of that is that, you know, as I said earlier, it creates a sort of cohesive pressure system to the extent that it doesn't really matter anymore whether you're being targeted by a nation-state actor or targeted by a criminal or targeted by a hacktivist. Those distinctions are technically important, of course, but really in terms of the impact on the target, it feels like it has very much the same impact. As you said, state actors will be controlled by the state, directed by the state. Hacktivists will be motivated by almost like a patriotic alliance, so ideological alliance. And criminal actors will be motivated by, obviously, financial gain. So that's a difference. You see a difference in the constraints also. State actors generally governed by national laws, generally aware of at least international laws, and constrained by global norms. Right? So they kind of behave actually, despite their high level of capability, they behave in a sort of constrained way.
Very interesting.
Whereas the ideological hacktivists are not constrained by any of those things, right? By definition, they're operating outside of the norms. The criminals aren't constrained by law either, obviously. So there we see differences. But below that, if you start kind of analyzing what they do and how they do it, the lines really start blurring.
Okay, can you explore that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, what stands out for us, if we look at the volumes of these incidents and the impacts that they have on the victims, is perhaps two characteristics.
Okay.
The one is that it's a continuous imposition of cost on the victim, and that is asymmetrical. Right? So if you take, in August 25, there was the Jaguar Land Rover incident. Right? We might not know what the actor actually gained. Right? So in traditional cyber extortion, they would have tried to extort a ransom. Maybe they get paid, maybe they don't.
Right.
But the insights we got at the time were that it cost the UK economy something in the region of £2 billion. That's highly asymmetric, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a very low-cost way to impose cost on a victim or in a society. Now, whether those actors, in fact, the Jaguar Land Rover actors were not state-aligned at all. Yeah. But the dynamic is the same, right? When a criminal actor hits a victim, there's this asymmetric imposition of cost. And when you multiply that by the rate at which these incidents are happening, what you start to see is this kind of like almost debilitating imposition of cost. The numbers between the 26 report and the 25 report of cyber extortion, which is the most prolific form of cybercrime, they increased by like 45%. It's now thousands of victims a quarter that we record. So there's this like continuous imposition of cost, right? In this asymmetric fashion.
Charl, you mentioned the increase in cyber extortion, 45% in a year since the last time you released Security Navigator. What I'm interested in understanding the impact of that from at a global perspective, so at a country level, but also for me, through the market segments that we think about, so from multinationals to large nationals into small and medium businesses, right? Well, everyone's affected now.
So as you said, everyone's affected. We track, I think it's 20 industries in our framework. There's victims in all the industries. There's victims in most countries in the world. But the patterns that emerge are quite clear. And what they tell us, incidentally, is that what we're experiencing is sort of an opportunistic pattern. The analogy I use is that it's a little bit like throwing mud at a map, and it sort of sticks a little bit everywhere. Yeah. And the bigger the country is on the map, the more it sticks. So if you use that analogy, then country-wise, it's the big economies that are bearing the brunt, the USA and Canada, and then I think that's followed by the UK. And then some of the bigger European economies, Germany, Italy, France, and even some of the smaller European economies. Belgium is quite high up on the list. Then it moves across to the other English-speaking economies.
What really stood out to me there was the language piece. You've talked about this proliferation and extortion from an English language-speaking country perspective. Can you talk about the other side of it from a non-English?
The others, yeah. So the pattern generally is that the crime tracks economy sizes, right? Because it's opportunistic. But it also then within that pattern tends to favor English-speaking countries. And we think that's because of because the crime that we're observing, if you put the cyber elements aside, the crime that we're observing is a crime of extortion. And extortion, bizarrely, actually requires a kind of a level of empathy, right? You need to understand your victim in order to identify the levers that you can use. And so attackers, I think, have tended towards places where they can speak the language or read the language, and where they can sort of understand the business environment, which feels like culturally similar. Now that is changing, and we are seeing more and more attackers from places that speak other languages, French, for example, and attackers who can operate in other languages, German or Italian. But one of the things that we're observing this year in the data is this proliferation out into other regions where we hadn't seen victims before, as they start to kind of master those languages or just look for more victims out of those sort of traditional hunting grounds.
There was mention of, I think, 35 new countries that were facing these similar problems that you found in the last year.
35 countries where we had never seen victims before, where we now are recording victims. 10 of those were in Africa. And that's, we think, signals two things. The one is a kind of a fragmentation of the threat actor environment.
Okay.
So there's many more smaller actors, and you can imagine they're sort of looking for victims in other places. But we also think, given my arguments previously about the sort of cultural empathy that's required, we also think it's one of the places where Gen AI might be playing a role.
I was waiting for Gen AI to turn up. So tell us more about that, because that obviously plays an impact here.
Yeah, look, it's very hard to assess the impact of a tool set on a threat actor. Right? We don't actually see what they're doing. It's very hard to measure it. But we had been anticipating for some time that this barrier to entry, which is the cultural affinity that an extortionist needs, might be overcome by tools that help you to very quickly understand what you're looking at, even if it's in a different culture, even if it's in a different language. And so now it enables threat actors in different places to extort victims in different places in a way that perhaps wasn't as easy before.
The language piece is super interesting. But what I really want to dig into a little bit more, because I think this really piqued my interest, is culture and why that matters. You talked about empathy. Can you explore that with us a little bit more?
Yeah, so in cybercrime, there's cyber and crime. And cyber is pretty universal. A computer is a computer. They sort of look and feel the same, and you compromise them the same. But the crime part that's sort of driving all of this cyber is the crime of extortion. So we very deliberately use the word cyber extortion. And extortion is about surfacing levers of influence over somebody else. And that is not universal.
Right.
Americans will feel compelled in one way, the British maybe in a different way. And so the attacker has to be able to sort of really understand where they are, kind of think themselves into the mindset of that victim in order to identify those levers. And so, of course, as they scale, they tend to prefer cultures and businesses who they can sort of understand. So, for example, Japan has a very big economy, very digital, it's very online. A Japanese computer is the same as any other computer. But we see almost no victims, or proportionally, it's an anomalous number of victims in Japan. And I don't think that's because they have more secure computers. I think it's because the threat actors are just not, haven't up to now made the effort to develop that sort of cultural affinity there.
I don't think I'd thought of it in that way before. The cultural impact. So understanding what matters to a victim, that's what drives an extortionist.
Yeah. And then, there's another very interesting anti-pattern that we see. We spoke about Japan, which kind of stands out in the figures. The other two big economies that stand out in the figures are China and Russia, which again sort of speaks to this idea of a sort of political alignment or a political serendipity around the behavior of these actors. But in the case of China, Russia, and North Korea, there's actually another aspect that we can observe, which is that these groups publicly assert their kind of anti-targeting behavior. They make a point of saying we will not impact victims in these countries. And within the sort of cybercrime forums, there's actually mechanisms for signaling it. So they'll make it clear that as a group, they will not, and as they build relationships between each other and build alliances, etc., they're very deliberate, they're very clear that they won't impact those countries. And it stands out in the figures. So I think part of that is culture and language, but part of it is a very deliberate anti-targeting behavior.
Super interesting, Charl. Can we bring it back? Can we bring it back to the West? Because it's not just about the East, is it? We can bring this right back to home. Can you talk a little bit about culture and how that might be impacted right here?
Yeah, and just to support your point, when we look at the law enforcement data, which I mentioned previously, which we've released for the first time this year, you do see that there's a lot of actors in the US and in the UK. Actually, the UK is quite high, and scattered across the rest of Europe. So there are actors in those places also. Make no mistake. Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the things that emerged in the last few years, but sort of quite recently, is these very anomalous actors comprising of young people in countries like the UK, Canada, the US, and France, who kind of fluidly create groups, alliances, a scattered spider we discuss in the report, and the crowd that hit Jaguar Land Rover were sort of one of those affiliations. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find interesting about them is that they have a very high level of kind of cultural empathy that doesn't just help them in the extortion, but is perhaps the hallmark of their techniques also. Their techniques focus around sort of social engineering type attacks, where you can see they get it. You know, they've worked in those jobs, or they've got friends who do them. They know how those businesses operate. And so generally, they don't have to technically compromise computers at all. They're just using their, I think, deep intuition about how business culture in these places works to have enormous impacts.
Thank you. So we've talked about language, culture. We've talked about real social engineering, so people actually just infiltrating organizations. Can we take that a step further? What if you could leverage AI to do something similar? And I know you've been exploring this. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in this area?
Yeah, so far, most of the applications of AI in actual incidents have been on that social side, right? Creating fake websites, creating fake emails. And there was that very noteworthy example from a year or two ago about a fake CEO. Jay, be careful. That was created in what they call a business email compromise attack, right? To convince an employee to transfer money. But one of the trends that we discuss in the report is what they call fake remote worker scams, where in this case it started with North Korean actors apply for remote jobs, typically in technology and typically in the US. And then they go through the whole process of vetting, interviews, competency tests, the whole thing, with the support of various AI tools, and get themselves employed as if they were people in America, as if they were,
Wow.
Yeah. And then, so then they solicit the help of, also by social engineering, of Americans, typically, jobless or, financially challenged people, to then receive the materials that have to be received, including the laptop, to the extent that some people have now been arrested and prosecuted for running entire farms of laptops, where each laptop represents another entirely fake worker. And then the North Koreans remote into those laptops and actually do the work. But sitting at home, yeah.
Oh my God.
And it has two effects. The first is we believe it actually generates revenue for North Korea. It's a very impoverished place. And we've reason to believe that some of those workers are working multiple jobs also, using these laptops in someone's lounge, somewhere in Minnesota or something.
So this is a very different type of extortion. So this is them. So this is a North Korea actor applying for jobs in the US. And what are they extorting? Are they just taking the income back? Is that just
they're not
paid?
extorting. Well, they're not necessarily at that stage extorting anything. So in the first instance, they've just hacked themselves into a job, like literally life hacking. They hack themselves into a job, which they then do from North Korea. But it then also gives them an access vector.
Yes, of course.
Right? So the first example of this that really came to light was by a security company that had been infiltrated like that. They sent the laptop.
Wow.
The laptop came online, and then they immediately started detecting this suspicious behavior as the guy was moving through the business. So there's two levels, right? The one level, they're pulling a salary, and then the other level, they're creating backdoors into these businesses.
Wow, that's scary on many fronts. So we've talked about countries, talked about a lot of different things. Can we bring it down a level and let's just start talking about how it affects business in the very real world? We're used to talking about multinationals and how they respond. We talk about large national accounts, how they respond, and the onus is very much on them. But actually, the victims are everywhere now. So it's SMB all the way through to multinationals. Yeah. How does an SMB protect themselves from something like this? That's a lot of pressure to put on small business.
Yeah. And you remember, if we go back to that sort of distinction we made between the cyber part and the crime part, right? The crime effectively involves taking something from the victim that the victim needs, right? Rather than something that the criminal wants. It's not like theft. And that means that every business becomes a potential victim, right? Because every business relies on its digital systems. And so it really hits across all industries and hits across all business sizes. But because there are more small businesses in most economies, and because small businesses, of course, less capable, less resourced, the majority of the victims that we recall are in that small business category. I think it's 67% this year of the victims of cyber extortion that we record would fall under the heading small, medium.
67%, you said?
I think it was 67%,
wow.
Yeah. And it's also growing faster. It's growing faster than the average.
Wow.
So the growth is in that small business category too.
We talked about segments. SMB is actually accelerating in terms of the victim rate. What about industries? How is that being affected? We talk a lot about critical national infrastructure. I think the government's approach to C&I is expanding. Their breadth of view of that is expanding. Can you give us your view on what you've seen in the last year from a vertical perspective?
Yeah. It's funny. I'm genuinely not very interested in talking about verticals because I feel like the threat actor probably doesn't pay that much attention. But you do see some patterns, and actually it's a nice segue back to the discussion we had earlier about the behaviors of the threat actors. So when we look at cybercrime, every industry is impacted. And the industries tend to be impacted sort of in the proportion to the importance they hold in that economy.
Right.
So we'll see manufacturing would be the most impacted industry in the US and in Germany. In the UK, it's professional services and financial services more. But all of these industries are interconnected because of that kind of web of interdependence that we spoke about that really characterizes a modern economy.
Right.
And most of these groups don't really mind which industry they impact. So as I said, for an extortionist, a cyber extortionist, they just want to put that business in a position where they're prepared to pay a ransom because they need it to keep operating. And the hacktivist actors that we spoke about, they just want to make a point. And they don't need to make that point for a specific business. They want to make the point for the collective, right? So in this case, it's not the supply chain that they're impacting, but it's the sort of collective state of mind, the political will, the sense of cohesion and well-being in a society is what they're attacking. And the business is just a vehicle to signal that.
Right.
State actors, I think, may be more targeted. They may have, for example, specific intelligence gains. But one of the incidents that we talk about in this year's report is the Salt Typhoon attacks, concentrated on telcos, but reaching across into all kinds of essential and critical infrastructure.
So actually, it can be more indiscriminate than vertical specific.
Yeah, I think it's more indiscriminate than we like to believe. I think what creates behaviors around sectors primarily is the choices of platforms that they run.
Okay.
Right? So you'll see similarities in healthcare or in education.
It's really interesting. It goes back to a point you made earlier, which is about how we like to bucket things, and perhaps those buckets don't actually apply. So what we're saying is it's not specific to a market segment. It's not specific to a vertical. It's almost indiscriminate. If we take that back to the JLR discussion, 5,000 suppliers were impacted. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing from that perspective?
Well, I think it's typical. So every business exists in an ecosystem, right? And I don't like that term, supply chain. It sounds like top down and it sounds linear. I think ecosystem is a better word. I think we operate in a web of interdependence. It's actually one of the reasons why I don't like to think and talk about verticals and segments. Of course, there are specificities, right? But it gives you the impression that this problem is happening there or to them, or that it's targeted on an individual within the economy or within the society. And that may be true in terms of the direct impact. But I think what we miss is this collective, this cumulative impact that it has on an economy and on a society. So the JLR story gives us a very clear example of how one incident can have these cascading economic effects, right? But there's also cascading psychological and emotional effects that you have to bear in mind, right? People start to feel unsafe. People start to distrust the digital systems and maybe start to distrust each other. We don't know what's true or what's not true anymore. We don't want to put our money in the bank. It's like it's corrosive, I think, on the sort of elements that a society and an economy need to thrive.
Right. Well, that sounds pretty gloomy, but I know your outlook is more positive, and I know that your thoughts on how we come together to solve some of these problems. There's some real world things that we can do now, and there's things that we have to be thinking about for the future. Can you give us some insights into it and share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the technical components of this I almost find frustrating because I feel like those are solved problems, right? We know how to stop or at least mitigate the impact of a cyber extortion attack. We can do it. We know how to mitigate for distributed denial of service. We've got the capabilities, we've got the technologies, we've got the know-how. Businesses like ours exist because we bring those capabilities to bear, and they are impactful. I think the challenge is how we do it consistently and at scale, bearing in mind that it's not just those big, competent, capable businesses that are being impacted, but really across the board that we have to protect people.
Thank you for that. And it's pleasing to hear that we can do that today. We know we can do that. But you talk about doing it at scale. Yeah. What does that mean about a collective partnership? Is there a role that government needs to play? Is there a role that industry needs to play? Is there a different role that industry needs to play Is there a different role that, consumers on the ground need to play? How does this look for you? What do you see?
Maybe I'm naive, but you use the word collective, and I kind of feel like that's the bit that needs to emerge in our consciousness. That there is, I think there is a collective adversary that is having a collective impact on a collective us. Right? It's impacting all of us, whether it's because it disrupts the supply chain, or because it creates a state of uncertainty and anxiety, or because it imposes this opportunity cost on us. Right? It's like where the time and the money and the energy that we could be spending doing innovation or solving for climate change, or creating art or doing other wonderful things, we're now spending playing whack-a-mole with these these actors. So I think that the key word for me is in that collective thinking.
Knowing you and know how thoughtful you are about the future, is there something we should be thinking? Is there a different way that we should be thinking about how we approach this, or do we just keep doing the same things? Yeah, we can be collective about it, but do you have a thought in mind that maybe there's a fundamental shift that we need to make?
Yeah, I've got several thoughts, and look, this is a big issue. I think one change that needs to happen is that we kind of surface this crisis mentality.
Yeah. That
we start saying, look, it's actually not okay, right? And there is an other that is involved here, and they're imposing this cost, and we're not okay with that. And that, I think, moves us firstly away from like an individualist, my risk mindset towards a sort of collectivist, our society mindset. So I think that's important. That then very quickly surfaces ideas around public-private partnerships, around community service, around the role that insurance plays, around how businesses think about their supply chain or ecosystem. Is supply chain security a compliance cost that you put on your supply chain, or is it a collective project? With you and your supplier ecosystem. So I think all of those kind of ways of thinking surface when you make that switch in your mind, and then of course that provides opportunity for government to think a little bit differently about how they regulate around those ideas. Are the regulations that are in place appropriate, if that's the mindset that you want to surface? Are the incentives and the penalties in the right places?
That's super. Well, it's super interesting for me. It also gives me hope, and I know you're a very hopeful person.
I am, yeah.
So just in terms of that, and I get that sense of it. You do all of this research. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. It's accelerating. You've talked about a collective we. Love that idea. Are you truly hopeful for the future?
Yeah, I am. And our slogan is, building a safer digital society. I think it all starts with that. Not a safer society, but a safe society. I think we should have a vision, we should have the intent to build a safe society. In a safe society, everyone prospers. People can innovate. We can all grow. We can go about our actual business, of living life and being human. And I think that's a worthy project. I'm excited about it.
Thank you, Charl. Brilliant. Thank you, audience, for tuning in to this episode. 2026 Security Navigator is available to download now. The link to download the report is in the show notes and also available on our website.